Hey there, I'm Pete Townsend, and this is Money Never Sleeps. We look inside the minds of entrepreneurs and at the crossover of startups, enterprise, finance, technology, and life as we know it. On the show this week, I'm joined by Evan Miyazono to talk about his new project, Atlas Computing, and how they're helping scale human control over risky AI capabilities. I seem to be falling into a number of serendipitous situations recently where I find myself at the intersection of AI and blockchain. This week's chat with Evan took place at that same intersection, but more at the conceptual level rather than at the hardcore technical level. After finishing a PhD in applied physics at Caltech, Evan Miyazono jumped into blockchain with Protocol Labs in 2017 on a mission to build systems that affect real people. After years as a researcher and then head of network goods, Evan recently launched Atlas Computing with his co-founder with a goal of building an international standards organization of provably safe AI. In our chat, Evan and I look at both the intended and unintended consequences of AI, how society's own actions makes it hard to define good behavior for humans, some of the crossover points between blockchain and AI, and how Evan's thinking about aligning stakeholders for the funding of Atlas Computing. All right here on Money Never Sleeps.
Listen, Evan, we've got our chat being thankfully teed up by my friend Niall Dennehy, who is our number one fan for Money Never Sleeps. He was on the show years ago, back in 2019 when we first started. And I know that you met him recently. So big shout out to Niall. So thank you Niall for introducing us.
Appreciate it.
But what I was thinking, Evan, is that Niall was listening because he introduced us. And he introduced us hopefully because he figured out what you and I riffed on when we spoke last week for the first time, is that I recently did an episode 241 with my Santa Maria. She and I started riffing on the intersection of AI and blockchain. And it was a reflection of her reading recently of Scary Smart by Moog Dot. And you're actually living proof that blockchain and AI do have a home together, okay? Based upon your history with Protocol Labs and things that you had worked on before. And also with AI, which is the main everything with Atlas Computing, okay? So Niall knew what he was doing either in his conscious or in his subconscious with this introduction. But since then, I have read Scary Smart by Moog Dot. Coincidentally, it gave me some more insights into your vision with Atlas Computing, and I really want to get into that. But before we dig into Atlas Computing, to get us started, could you bring us through your backstory, how you got to this point?
I was always a very optimistic, loved math and science as a kid, always very optimistic about the future, and was convinced about a year or two into undergrad that material science was the thing that I wanted to spend my time on because it was going to give us all sorts of science fiction scale technology. And after finishing undergrad, I realized I didn't have the math and science background that I wanted to make the kind of contributions I was thinking of. And so I applied to exclusively physics and applied physics programs and ended up doing an applied physics PhD on a problem that I thought was really interesting and really important. We were building hardware for a provably secure quantum internet. I like to say that for a set of parameters, we got from 0.01% efficient to 0.2% efficient in terms of can you have something that looks like an optical quantum RAM. And while that's a 20x improvement, it's not the 99.99999% efficient that you roughly need in order to have a useful engineering device. And so rather than spending an entire career trying to make progress on that, I started looking for things that had what I would later describe as higher leverage. And so I went looking for specifically places where I could be a generalist. I wanted small startups where I could work on hardware solutions to important problems, particularly like neglected hardware solutions. And after talking to a bunch of startups, I found that most of the ones that seemed most promising pegged me as a specialist. And in my desire to be a generalist, I ended up letting myself be talked into joining Protocol Labs. My buddy from college said, hey, we're doing an unconventional fundraise. Would you mind helping out my startup? And that was founder Juan Bennett, and who I knew from college. And I ended up being the first PhD hire. My time there initially was absolutely incredible. The kind of stuff that people tell startup stories about. I would like bike over around or when the sun was rising and then come back like around midnight like 6 days a week for 3 months straight as we were trying to get this
Wow.
up to speed. And I was the one sleeping the most. It was an incredible team at that time. And I was basically a like hired gun numerate person where like if there was a general math problem, people who were just like could sit down and write code and say, Evan, solve this problem, come back to me with the function. And I'd come back with it. So that was great. I ended up doing all sorts of helping out with a bunch of various pieces from like reviewing legal documents to like solving. I think I was one of the key influences on the block reward halving time. It was like, we need this number. I don't care what it is. I think it should be somewhere in this range while I make a decision. And then ended up going from that to having enough funding that we could pay world scale top talent in cryptography to work on some of our research problems. We couldn't hire them because it was 2017 at a time when you couldn't hire cryptographers from tenured roles into a startup. I just was outside the Overton window. And so I was asked to set up a grant program. I set this up, and it being Protocol Labs, every question becomes, how do you do the best possible version of this thing? And so that led me into doing a significant amount of reading about meta science or meta research. And this was a lot of like, what does the best grant program look like? What properties does it have? What makes it better than others? What makes it more effective in achieving its goals? And this rather seamlessly transitions into one, DSci. I think we've been thinking about how to accelerate science for a while when people started doing DSci. And so I had a talk at the first DSci at ETH Denver event where I rewrote my entire presentation in the first, like as I was watching the other talks, because I realized that I was giving a talk to an audience that was not present. And so I was like, here's a bunch of context that you might want to consider or be aware of if you're trying to change how science works. And that the second thing that transitions smoothly into is this question of how to have better mechanisms and tools for public goods funding. I'm like strongly of the belief that crypto is the best platform for macroeconomic experiments that the world has ever seen. And if you want to have more public goods, there's this fundamental question of what is good? What public goods should exist? Because there are an infinite number that could exist. And this is the same problem with science. Like what science is, if you want more good science or you want science to go faster, then the metric of good or like faster ends up being pretty subjective. And so the question becomes, how do you set up mechanisms to elicit and aggregate opinions about what better is and what faster is and things like that? And use tools like markets or use tools like voting in order to be able to do that in a more scalable and efficient way. The last thing I was doing was setting up what I think in hindsight is definitely categorizable as a venture studio around different types of mechanisms for supporting public goods and commons. We ended up spinning out like 5 or 6, depending on if you count Atlas, 3 for-profits, 3 nonprofits from a team of, I think, roughly 20. So a very small team spinning out, but spun those out. And one of the projects that we had was a research project on how to have human collaboration with arbitrarily powerful AI problem solvers in a way where you can have high confidence that the AI is creating the outcomes that you want. In some perspectives, solving like / addressing, in other perspectives, sidestepping the alignment problem. And this was a research problem. And this researcher, Davidad, went to UK's ARIA to go and continue de-risking this problem, showing that it is possible in theory as a long-term solution to some of these AI risks. And after he and I discussed a lot, it seemed like the most important thing I could do, given how worried I was about a lot of transitions with AI, was to go and work on setting up a nonprofit to incrementally deploy scoped versions of solutions using this architecture so that if/when he shows that this is useful, we have an entity that has built a lot of confidence and done the reps on deploying smaller pieces so that we can deploy something larger.
Deep, absolutely. And for those that may not be familiar with public goods in a tech context, can you just describe that?
Absolutely. So public goods and commons are types of things out in the world where you can get them without paying for them. Canonical examples are things like rule of law, national security, clean air, access to clean water or clean drinking water, things like this. The definitions get fuzzy. The distinction between public goods and commons is whether you having more reduces the ability for other people to have more. And so you can imagine how with like national security or rule of law. That isn't actually true. An arbitrary number of people can enjoy it. Whereas with something like clean drinking water, you could imagine suddenly if one person takes all of it, then there isn't enough left for anyone else. These boundaries are really hand wavy. So everyone can enjoy clean air until I polluted it. And then there's only so much polluting that can be done. And so I'm treating it like a commons, you're treating it like a public good.
Okay.
And so our mechanisms, or our approaches might fundamentally differ. When people in blockchain usually talk about public goods, they're talking about things like open source software, infrastructure, things that don't have business models. They're talking about science, like the proceeds of research. If they're under patent, they're more like commons. But eventually, knowledge becomes a public good or a commons where anyone can benefit from it. And so the funding of those things tends to be more challenging because you can't extract resources in exchange for use in order to fund the creation of these. And so it usually takes governance to do so.
Would all open source software then be considered to be public goods?
So in my time at Protocol Labs, I, for a while, ran a small team that we called Abstraction Lab that does a few independent research projects. And one of those projects, Nadia Asparova, whose writing I totally recommend, she wrote this book titled Working in Public, published by Stripe Press. And she says that it's not correct to classify open source as either a public goods or a commons. The software itself is a public good, but the developer's time is a commons, and those are not separable fundamentally because of how open source works. And so I think that I would definitely recommend anyone who's interested in like the economics of open source generally read that book and maybe her previous work, Roads and Bridges. She wrote with the Ford Foundation. But
good. Because my thoughts on this are ruminating, and it's coming from just the fact that blockchain protocols in and of themselves, composable blockchain protocols, are generally open source. Yeah. However, the developers have decided that in order to govern the network, they may introduce a token, or perhaps to operate the supply and demand of services and products on their network, that they would launch a token in order to do that. And that token obviously is not public goods. So while you can get the software that you may not be able, and you can access the protocol and perhaps build on it in order to truly make it usable for your end value proposition, it is outside of a public goods framework because, well, you need a token. Right. So thank you for setting the record straight here. Appreciate it.
Thanks go to Nadia, definitely.
Definitely. No, I'll check that out. We'll put it in the show notes as well, Evan. So thanks for sharing that.
I should also note, for people who are open source developers, the first 2 or so chapters will be like, they have a lot of good data points that you can use to make arguments about the importance of open source. They're very skimmable if you're very familiar with open source and you're like active on GitHub, for instance. In that case, you can skim to the last, I think, 3 or so chapters that are very high quality and have a lot of new information, even if you're very familiar with open source. So I wouldn't want people to pick it up, assume from the first chapter that it's all very remedial and below their level, and drop it entirely.
Okay, cool. Well, listen, let's move on to Atlas Computing, because I want to hear about this.
Absolutely.
And what it is, why you decided to do it, what you wanted to become.
Yeah, so I guess the most important thing to describe is probably the general approach. I think that a lot of systems today are relying on separate learned systems to provide feedback on outputs from machine learning systems. You can talk about having control via norms and control via rules. Pick a politician who has decided to defy a lot of norms. Only when you see someone defying norms do you realize how strong or weak the rules actually are. Like, the reason we have judicial review comes from the fact that the rules are known to have lots of gaps, and we have judges who are experts and can interpolate between those gaps. And so I claim that with learned systems now, all of this, like, here's a bunch of training data, ingest it. Now here's the beginning of an answer, give me the rest of the answer. All of these systems are control via norms. There are very few people who can claim to be working on something that is controlled by rules for AI in a way that the AI is intrinsically limited by the rules. and it doesn't require a human to do that interpretation, or it doesn't require a learned system to do that interpretation. And I think this is an important distinction because in my mind, I'm fairly confident that we will have the ability to spin up new AI problem-solving agents. Maybe this is GPT-5 or maybe it's GPT-6, but at some point, you're going to be able to have a personal assistant that's fairly effective. I would say that I treat GPT-4 as like my college intern who is from everywhere and majoring in everything. Like you still want to check them on everything, but you can have them do a lot of things that aren't particularly pleasant for a person to do, or like may require a bit of knowledge that only someone who had that kind of background might know. LLMs are going to slowly grow in capabilities. And at some point, you're probably going to be able to effectively hire someone, except instead of it being a person, it's going to be an AI agent. And it's going to be far cheaper than employing someone, a real person. At that point, as long as you see a return on that investment, there's going to be a financial incentive for you to do that and hire more, run more of these AI agents. And at that point, logically, you'd be limited by how well you can get these agents to do exactly what you want in practice. And so you're going to have a lot of agents out there in the world doing things that people don't really understand or don't, and like have an incentive to not have complete control over. And so the goal of Atlas computing, going back to this architecture, is to have a set of rules where you can express what good outputs or good behaviors look like, what properties they have in an objectively evaluatable way. And then when your AI systems generate these things, they like generate solutions, those proposed solutions can be validated against the specifications you generated. And you can get computational proof that the solution that was proposed does in fact meet the specification. And it's worth noting that this is not possible for like, show that this language model is not biased at this point.
Yep.
But it is possible for something like show that this software output does in fact meet a specification. When I talk about specification languages, it's worth noting that computer science has formal methods. You can do a mathematical proof that shows that this piece of software will never will never be in one of these states. It will never
really.
Yeah, you won't have a system halt. You won't have a buffer overflow. It's incredibly expensive to do. It's surprisingly poorly known. There are researchers in charge of validation at Frontier Labs who are like recently becoming aware of this entire field that exists. The FAA has like a de facto requirement that you use formal methods to validate flight critical software. And so a lot of people who do formal methods end up being related to aviation, but like it's incredibly expensive to use. You'll see formal methods also occasionally used in smart contract work. It's really hard to specify and validate anything. But most of these things are, can you generate a specification? But can you translate from natural language to a specification? And can you generate a proof that is easily checkable that this specification is met by this code? And the first one is probably very easy with language models. And the second one is something that we should expect learned systems to be good at and to be trustworthy on. Because if you can generate a proof, you can't fake math.
Okay, so taking this well-known yet expensive method in computer science and in proving a mathematical proof, like you said, a code output is actually going to perform.
Yeah.
And taking that idea and that same construct and applying it to AI agents that are being developed right now, but that with the next phase, the next wave, the next step, the next evolution of AI through GPT-5, 6, like you mentioned, onto that what you're proposing, what you're doing here with Atlas computing is going to become an absolute necessity.
Yeah. When I say that we're going to find specific areas where we can show incremental benefits from this architecture, I'm thinking that there are things like software generation, where many people have been talking about how there are risks where something like GitHub Copilot could introduce bugs from training data into code that is generated. And I think that it would be fundamentally better to have software generation that was done focused on specifications and make it as easy as possible to do that. And so that's one area we're interested in. I also am interested in trying to increase the safety of, or I'm interested in trying to show that you can have specification languages for physical systems. And the area that I'm most interested in as a first step is small molecule biochemistry. I was recently told that there's something on the order of like 1 billion chemicals that you can are available if you have the right licenses. About a quarter of them you can just go and buy today. And this is a small fraction of the 10 to the 60 estimated synthesizable molecules. And I think that we're going to probably have AI systems that can start saying like, oh, here's a new molecule and a way to make it. And it might do these things. And when people are doing that, I think it's important that people have tools to validate the safety of those end products and all intermediate results. Similarly, I think that when if a language model at some point is able to identify and patch vulnerabilities, around the same language model might be able to write exploits for those. And so I think that there's a lot of these breakthroughs that look very symmetrically offensive and defensive, given the current architecture path. And so my hope is that we can try to push on an architecture path where you have asymmetrically defensive solutions. So you can forecast toxicity before you can get the molecules. You can generate specification-based code to patch or to make sure you have provably, I'm not going to say bug-free, but you can prove robustness in certain ways of these cyber-physical systems before you have scalable AI-based exploits. And I think that this spans well beyond that to a bunch of other domains, but I think that it felt like we needed a nonprofit to start building mindshare, start explaining what this architecture is, start recruiting individuals and funders and sourcing problems and potential partners and customers and just doing a lot of matchmaking and getting those groups to mix.
Yeah, I get that. And what's right at the top of my mind with all this, Evan, is that this is a set of standards that you're proposing, right? Rather than developing the proofs yourself. And can you talk about the difference there between deciding to start with the standards and to get big stakeholders on board with that versus actually developing the code that could be deployed behind it?
Yeah, I think that pushing on the frontier of AI capabilities is very expensive. And I think that a really good reason why we're not trying to do fine-tuning of llama or open weight model is that it's just very expensive. And my co-founder and I, we're a nonprofit of 2 people. We don't have the expertise or background to do that. I'm looking to hire someone with expertise in fine-tuning relevant to formal verification. But I think that this is also the kind of thing where everyone who works in or near this should be able to see themselves as part of this ecosystem, as part of this next step. I truly believe that this is a better solution for de-risking a lot of potential concerns about AI. And if I can, that it works best if everyone can see themselves as part of this. And this can really be something more like a standard, as you said. My general take is that within about 5 years of when we have AI that can do 80% or so of knowledge work, we're probably going to have either a world that is very hostile to human life, or we'll have something that looks a lot like a world government for AI. And I think that anything that I can do to help manifest good governance for AI systems, and I say looks like a world government for AI, this could be like all of frontier labs agree that these are certain lines that they're not going to cross. That would be sufficient in my mind.
Okay.
But it could also be something that looks like a branch of the UN that says, this is an entity that is not a corporation that is eliciting feedback and aggregating it in a way that everyone should feel comfortable with, and the UN is legitimizing it. I keep using the word legitimizing because of Vitalik's post, the scarcest resource in Web3's legitimacy.
Totally. There's a few threads that I could pull on here, Evan, and one is probably more of an observation with what you said a couple of minutes ago, that it is very expensive in AI. If you look at the VC funding landscape between 22 and 23, what happened was that with the crash in Web3 funding that happened because of Terra Luna going off the cliff, and then Three Arrows Capital, Celsius, and then finally FTX, that VC funding just dried up. And where did it all go? It went towards generative AI.
And also, I think the sheer amount of it just shrank a bit too, because interest rates also went up. And
totally. Yeah. And there was no longer the COVID fueled money printing machine,
Yep.
right? So that happened. And then generative AI happened. The VC landscape went crazy about that. And then we had a little blip for a while called superconductors. And then that disappeared and went back to generative AI.
I was so skeptical with that from like day one. But my background is also materials, so I think I had a bit of an advantage.
I bet. And then what happened was that the VCs figured out that all of the big players had already, not that they had AI nailed, but they had AI funded. And that the biggest, most deepest pockets out there in tech were going to be the ones that really going to be able to drive this forward. So what do? And this makes perfect sense, and I get it, is that, listen, instead of trying to go deep in the development side, that's going to cost you a lot of money, that let's just influence the way that AI is being developed now and get the big players on board and say, listen, we've got these standards. This is the safe way to do it. And I think there's tons of opportunity there. And I'm thinking about this.
You transitioned from like what the investors are thinking, I think, to what people who care about AI futures are thinking. And like, I definitely agree if that's the transition. Interestingly, there are investors doing like some very unconventional plays, like seed investments to AI hardware companies that are presumably higher impact. Like, there are probably good places to put money. As I'm trying to build this ecosystem, I think there's going to be a lot of things at the interface between the learned system and the human user sitting in the chair that are going to be incredibly valuable. Like, if you think about, as an example, the number of things that people had to build between GPT-4 and people using Copilot. I think there are a lot of interesting things like that. And when I'm talking about building an ecosystem, I'm really interested in trying to identify all of those. Like, we need to give someone a tool with all the right affordances and great UX so that they can use AI in a in a way that has provable safety properties and things like that. So I think I claim and I hope, and my hypothesis is, there's a lot of interesting business opportunities there. But I definitely agree that if you want to, it is a time where we probably need to think more deeply around how we want AI to behave in the long term, rather than delegate that through market forces to a small number of tech companies.
Absolutely. We do need to spread this out. And this makes me think again of part of the premise of that book, Scary Smart by Mo Gadot, where he said, listen, what is good behavior and what is bad behavior is subjective. And there is a point of view on that. And when Obi-Wan Kenobi was being asked by Luke Skywalker, how come you never told me that Darth Vader was my father? And he's like, well, from a certain point of view, I did tell you. Your problem statement resonated with me, which was, everyone wants human level AI agents, but no one could define good behavior for humans. And forget about Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi. But Mo said it comes down to your point of view, right? The East looks at the West and sees bad behavior that the West thinks is good. But the West will look at the East and see bad behavior that the East thinks is good. And so there are some examples there that I could point to. For example, the East will commonly say that the West is the only part of the civilization on this planet Earth that has actually launched an atomic bomb.
The adage that I like in this general direction is, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Exactly.
Deeply troubling, but that doesn't make it any less valid.
So Mo said, listen, this is all going to come down to who's the master here? Who is the master developer of AI agents that will define, and it's their point of view on what is good and what is bad behavior.
Yeah, there's a rallying cry within the AI ethics field of aligned with whom. And I think it's an interesting question. It might not be the right question if your claim is let's sidestep alignment and have governance over the constraints. But yeah, I like this especially when I'm talking to an audience that has experience with crypto, because good behavior being subjective, I like to use the term intersubjective. This is somewhere between subjective and objective, where it is true because a lot of people believe it is true. Hyperstation is another term that comes up related to this, but Bitcoin taught computer scientists that security could be intersubjective. If people stopped believing Bitcoin was secure, they would then stop support it, stop participating in the protocol, and very soon it would actually be insecure. You used to have computational proofs of security where you'd say here's my oracle and I have this, and then it turned into my proof of security is based on this Nakamoto consensus with 51% or 66%.
Network effects.
Or 60%. And another thing that's fascinating is that cryptocurrencies reminded us that a lot of what we talked about with value and money having worth is also very intersubjective. The dollar has value because we believe the dollar has value. That makes it intersubjective. And I think AI is really reminding us that good behavior or moral behavior is also intersubjective. And it's fascinating that you could see these learned systems making some level of assumptions that are convenient, but we as a society draw a line of no, this level of assumption is crossing a line, and this kind of assumption is actively harming a group of people because it's implying to them that they're not the type of person who does X, Y, or Z. And this is an area of political contention. This is not something where there's an objective truth around how much probability, how much it's okay to say in general, this is true versus generalizations are harming a part of the population. And so I think that what we should do with AI, and the reason why I talk about us sidestepping the alignment problem, is that if you have a set of specifications where you say, I don't want the output to have any of these properties, or I do want the output to have these properties, you end up with an artifact that is human interrogatable that you can deliberate about, you can run governance on. And so it's very hard to find a way to take reinforcement learning from human feedback and have rules that you set at an international level and a national level and a local level and a personal level. But if you had constraints, you could potentially do this. And so I would love to see a world where you say, when I'm generating these pieces of software, I really want to make sure that these additional specifications are met and that I have additional assurances that it won't crash. Or if there are molecules that I'm going to be exposed to, I want to make sure that they don't mess with these metabolic cycles. I want to see a future where everyone can have some way to explicitly set an objective boundary of how they interact with others or with technology that is respected automatically by the technology, rather than something where you have the control by norms where it's yeah, don't do anything that this group of people thought was not the right thing to do.
Okay. It's such a wide open space. And back to the actual mission at hand that you have right now, you've got some fundraising to do, and this will all be through donors. What are the types, if you could imagine your top 5, doesn't need to be by name, but the type of organization or the type of donors that you would like to help fund this to get it going?
So I think that there's probably a few categories of donors. The category that's probably the most relevant here is that I think that from the Vitalik Techno-Optimism paper, people who are familiar with the term DIAC and see themselves as aligned with that kind of ideology, want to have better technology, want to have more capabilities, but want to do it responsibly and thoughtfully. And they want to support things that they think aren't going to be too risky. And if they want to invest in that kind of technology and they have gains they want to offset, then they could potentially donate to help me create an ecosystem and start spawning companies. And they can just watch the problems companies, people in our network, and potentially invest in those. I do have a short list of investors who have said that they'd be interested in chatting with any startups that we help form or spin out. And I would love to expand that list. And that's completely disjoint from the donor set. But I think they could be correlated. But I think there are also other types of individuals who might be interested, like pure accelerationists who think that regulation is coming and they'd rather see new capabilities that don't spook people who are worried about either safety concerns or ethics concerns. And I think that we will be a source of those. And so if people wanted to accelerate capabilities and didn't want to be triggering some concerns there, we could be a reasonable place to donate. I think there's also a lot of safety-minded people. Our initial funding actually comes from the Surviving and Flourishing Fund, and they are, as you can find pretty easily online, worried about long-term risks from AI. And I think that de-risking this open agency architecture is a really good direction for advancing reduction of AI risk. But I also think that there's a strong pitch to people who are mostly worried about the ethics of AI, in that I think that we should try to limit frontier models and advanced AI to places where we can have provable safety guarantees about their behavior. And I think that if you're worried about people playing an increasingly small role in decision-making, in like ethical decisions, then having a tool for deliberation and governance of AI outputs should be very compelling.
Definitely. No, I get that. And it's a unique undertaking, and one that is different than putting together an investor pipeline of the top types of investors you would like to have. You're thinking about those where it's a different value proposition that you have back to them. Very good point, though, about the fact that you are building an ecosystem, and there may be startups, projects that come off the back of this, which is going to be really interesting to see.
Success for me looks like a lot of successful startups that didn't exist and do exist now because of what we're doing. I love the polygram concept of default alive. I love creating things that people love enough to become responsible for and run with, so that I can create more scalable impact by helping people do a lot of those things. And I think that it is definitely true that for every 300 people who would join a small company to pursue one of like a product in a like provable safety properties AI domain, there's probably one person who's willing to and able to found that company and grow it to a few hundred. And so the bottleneck is finding those people, de-risking this for them, making it as easy and rewarding as possible. And then once they get going, trying to do it again.
All right. Where we round out all of our episodes, Evan, is with this one final question. What is something that people wouldn't expect to know about you?
I've never lived outside of California for more than 3 consecutive weeks, or never been outside of California for more than 3 consecutive weeks. I've tried many times. I've consistently failed. Something's always pulled me back in time.
No, I'm just not having been outside of California for more than 3 weeks at any one point in time is a significant achievement. And I've
been to like a dozen countries. Never had a good excuse to make it longer than that.
Yeah. From the time I've spent in California, I'd understand the draw. So thank you. But listen, Evan, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
That's a good question. Email is probably best, actually. I'm very reachable via all of the platforms. Twitter DMs are open. I'm Miyazono on my Twitter handle is my Telegram handle, and I do end up getting all those come to me. I don't add me on LinkedIn without a message, I guess.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Evan at atlascomputing.org is probably pretty easy.
Okay. All right, cool. That's great. And listen, thank you. This has been an incredibly eye-opening chat, and it's one that was important for me to have, to understand, and then share with our listeners because of some of the experiences that I've been through recently with getting closer to AI. And like I said, that this intersection with blockchain, which will be guiding some of the investments, hopefully, that we're about to make. So thank you for coming out to the show, and I look forward to our next chat. Okay.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, Pete.
That does it for this week, folks. Thanks to Evan Miyazono for opening up his mind to help us figure out why he does what he does. You can learn more about Evan and Atlas Computing on our website, moneyneversleeps.ie. We'll do a deeper dive into the output of this conversation in our Money Never Sleeps newsletter on Substack, so check that out on moneyneversleeps.substack.com and subscribe. If you like what you heard, please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, as it helps others to find the show. Also, thanks to Conan Brophy from Create Sound for mixing and editing this episode. Conan is an excellent media man to get in touch with when you're thinking about launching your own podcast. As for me, I'm an early-stage startup investor focused on where fintech meets crypto and crypto meets Web3, and I lead the Techstars Web3 Accelerator. There are plenty of links in the show notes on moneyneversleeps.ie on how to get in touch, so don't hesitate to reach out. Finally, till next time, thanks for listening. See ya!
Money never sleeps, pal.